Hello. My name is Franklin Childress. I'm the Director of Army Reserve Communications, and I am an Army Reserve civilian, and I am more than ready. My question to you is, are you ready this morning? Oh, you're sounding weak. Let me hear that again. All right, now, got to get it warmed up for the boss here. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Army Reserve Seminar for AUSA. Thank you for coming today. It's our pleasure to host you. And I would like to introduce at this time the 32nd Chief of the Army Reserve and the Commanding General of the United States Army Reserve Command, Lieutenant General Jeffrey Talley. Give it up for General Talley.
Good morning, everybody. Please take your seats. So let's see, is this mic on? So you can hear me? Perfect. No? Now we can. Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody. What we're going to do for about an hour and a half is we're going to have a little bit of a presentation, a little bit of a discussion, and most importantly, questions and answers on anything that you want to talk about pertaining to our Army or the Army Reserve. I want to start by introducing some of the Army Reserve senior leadership that's here on the front row. So I'll embarrass them just for a minute. So could I ask the senior leadership, can you guys stand up for a minute and turn around? It's important for you to see that I'm not entirely responsible for everything that we do, good or bad, in the Army Reserve. The first is we have Barb Sisson. Barb is the Assistant Chief of the Army Reserve. Okay? And this is Louis Vassat. He didn't do a great job as Deputy Commanding General for Operations, so we promoted him, made him Chief of Staff. So he's Chief of Staff for the Reserve, Army Reserve Component, and USARC, okay? You want to introduce him? Go ahead. We want to recognize Cindy's here with Louis, and they've been married how many years?
Too long.
20. Elaine, come on up. Pete Lennon is our new Deputy Commanding General for Support at USARC, came from the 377th, and Elaine, and I don't know how long you guys been married? 4 years, so there we go. See? Right. Dave Conboy, the new Deputy Commanding General for Operations as of 1 October, comes to us from the 416th Engineer Command, Theater Engineer Command up in Chicago. Dave? Jim Balaki is our Chief Executive Officer as well as dual-hatted Special Staff for SICE, but I look at him really more as part of the command team for USARC, all things civilian, all things for the entire U.S. Army Reserve Command. And Marie is his lovely bride. Marie is also a very distinguished scholar and leader in the department up in the Pentagon, so we got two for the price of one, so welcome them. We've got some of the senior staff. We've got Steve Austin, the Chief Financial Officer for the Army Reserve up at OCAR. So, Steve Austin. We have Guy Sands, who's our Director of Human Capital at OCAR, as well as owns the Army Reserve G1. We got Brigadier General Tammy Smith, really the Chief of Staff for OCAR. I think technically they refer to her as the Deputy Chief of Staff, but she runs the staff at OCAR up at Fort Belvoir. Tammy. And I'm call out Ferd. Ferd, are you around here? Is Ferdy Rosari in here? He's in another session. Ferdy Rosari is not here. He's in another forum. He's our 357 down at Fort Bragg for USARC, as well as our Readiness Director. So I want to at least take the minute to recognize the senior leaders for the Army Reserve, U.S. Army Reserve Command, and yeah, Glenn is also not here. Glenn Lesniak is at another forum on, I think on DISCA, and he is the new Deputy Chief for the Army Reserve. And I'm saving the best for last, Command Sergeant Major Thomas, and so Luther Thomas is the Command Sergeant Major for the U.S. Army Reserve Command, part of the command team, but also the Command Sergeant Major for the Army Reserve. And he's got some very special people to introduce. Sergeant Major.
All right, so I got 3 guests here today that I'd like to introduce to you. You've probably seen them before, but I'm going to introduce them formally. So I need Sergeant First Class Manella, Staff Sergeant Norby, and Specialist Carlson to come up, please. Okay. Sergeant First Class Manella was the 2013 U.S. Army Reserve and the Department of the Army Non-Commissioned Officer of the Year. And he was on HGTV too, just as an aside. Staff Sergeant Norby is our 2014 Non-Commissioned Officer of the Year. And Specialist Carlson is our 2014 Soldier of the Year. So one more time. Thank you.
And for the warrant officers who are probably saying, hey, where's Command Chief Wilson? She's at another forum, so we don't want to forget our Command Chief. So it's important to understand that the Army Reserve is a component and a command. And so some of the senior leaders up here represent the Office of the Chief of the Army Reserve, which is, if you will, a miniature version of the Army staff and handle all things for the component called the Army Reserve. And then the U.S. Army Reserve Command is our command headquarters, of course, at Fort Bragg. A lot of people don't understand the differences. We're the only component of the Army that is a global command as well as a component. And that is actually a very important detail that I want to emphasize because it allows us to serve the nation better, both at home and abroad. And before I get into a few remarks, I want to recognize my wife, Linda, in the front row, and my daughter, Ashley, who just got married, is also visiting from Indiana. So Ashley and Linda, you want to stand up and say hello? So just so you know, security is working. They were detained, as was I, because I didn't have my badge on this morning, and I was late getting here because they would not let me in without my badge. So there you go. So what you should have, I'll cover a couple quick things. Here's kind of the rules of engagement. We want to go through maybe, 30 minutes of presentation discussion. I've got a short video to show you, and then really get into Q&A. And I would encourage you to start thinking about the questions and discussion points that you want to have, whether you're part of the Army Reserve or another part of our great Army or other force, recognizing that the questions do not all have to come to me. We have all the Army Reserve senior leaders right here in the front row, as well as a lot of the senior command teams out here in the audience as I'm looking around. So start thinking about what sort of comments or questions that you want to ask. There are also, I see a lot of people standing in the back. I think we have, if you maybe we'll move down, we can have some room for them to sit down. So I think we have some chairs that are available. So, like they tell you at church, move in. Maybe if everybody could move into the inner aisle, and that would free up some other seats so we don't have so many people standing in the back. That way they'll be more attentive. And the last thing I do want to recognize, because I see Patty sitting over here, is Patty Elliott, one of our Gold Star moms. Patty, could you stand up just for a minute? So I want to recognize Patty. As I mentioned yesterday at the family forum, Patty has had to endure the ultimate sacrifice of losing, in her case, a son in combat. And that's something that all of us dread in uniform and as parents. And she's, in my opinion, borne that magnificently in terms of, I can't imagine as a parent losing a son or daughter at all, especially in combat. And she's taken that grief and turned it into service to others, especially to the Army and the Army Reserve through family programs. And if you haven't seen, she's a new movie star and a new video that we have that we just released. It's excellent. She says more about family programs and serving others than I ever could, and I'd encourage you to see it. I'm sure if we haven't put it on YouTube yet, where's Franklin? Can we dump it on YouTube? Yes, sir. Okay, so make sure you take a look at that. So when you came in, you should have got, so there's 2 deliverables. I'm an engineer. I like to think in terms of deliverables. There's 2 deliverables that I'm going to talk about this morning that will help you understand what are the priorities and objectives for the Army Reserve in service to the Army and the nation. The first is a draft of Rally Point 32.1, which hopefully you got when you came in. And I want to just cover a few things that are in this. So if you have it, if you would actually hold it, and I'm going to walk through a few things. So I'll pretend I'm back in the classroom at Notre Dame or whatever university I was at in the past and walk you through some of this stuff. At least that way I know that at least you read it or at least looked at it before you threw it in the trash, okay? So the first thing is you'll notice Rally Point 32.1, the cover, it looks a lot like, oh, I want to recognize, let's see. For a second there, I thought I saw General Tucker in the audience. If I did, I wanted to recognize him from First Army. I think Paul Patrick, I saw Paul Patrick in earlier, so there's a number of his senior leaders here. What you'll notice is it looks just like Rally Point 32, which I wrote when I took command, that outlined my commander's guidance, if you will. And now I figured I'm a little over halfway through, it's time to come out with Rally Point 32.1. So Rally Point is the actual place on the ground where you rally. So you'll see, notice the little map symbol there, 32.1. Shows that we're a little bit further along than we were in Rally Point 32, closer to our new objective. Notice the objective has changed. It's now Force 2025, Joint Force and Army 2025. And so we're just moving a little closer to our new objective. You'll notice underneath the graph on the front of Rally Point 32.1, a life-saving, life-sustaining force for the nation. I'm going to come back and talk about what that means and why that is the vision, if you will, for the Army Reserve. Now, if you immediately flip over to the back of the panel, this will also keep you awake. That's another reason I'm having you do this. So you flip over to the back, you'll notice on the back is really kind of a recruiting poster. It's trying to get people to understand what is it about the Army Reserve that's special, depending on what community or organization you're part of. So I often say if you join the Army Reserve, we'll make you more marketable to yourself, to your family, to your community, to your civilian employer if you're a traditional reservist. And we're going to emphasize the citizen part and not so much the soldier part, because if I emphasize making you a better citizen, I'm convinced I'll get a better soldier, and the Army will get a better soldier, and in fact, we'll get a soldier for life with a loving and supporting family right behind him. And so on the back, I'm asking certain questions of families, communities, employers, Congress, and so this is kind of a, if you will, a recruiting poster for those that may not read it, they just want to look at the back. So then if you open up to the inside, what you're going to notice is a letter, which is pretty small. This is draft Rally Point 32.1. The real Rally Point 32.1 will be coming out in about the next 30 days. I'm going to shorten some of the print and some of the verbiage in the letter. I want to make the font a little bigger to read. Maybe that's more for me than anybody else. And I'm going to change a few things in the 2 centerpieces of Plan, Prepare, Provide and P3I, which I'll talk about in a minute. Before I get to those, I want you to turn to the part of the panel that says Vision, Mission, and Priorities. So if someone says, hey, CAR, CG, what's important to you? What are your priorities? What are your objectives? They're right here. You don't need to guess at what they are. First off, our vision is that we are a life-saving, life-sustaining force for the nation. Now, I actually didn't come up with that. Secretary Stockton, who used to be Assistant Secretary, Undersecretary for Homeland Defense, who helped draft the National Defense Act of 2012 that allows now federal forces and Federal Reserve in particular to be involuntarily mobilized to serve the nation at home and support a complex catastrophes. He coined that and gave me permission to use it in perpetuity for the Army Reserve. So think about, what is the Army Reserve? The Army Reserve is what? In-strength objective, still, for a few more weeks. It will change with the National Defense Act of 2015 getting approved probably in December. But right now, our in-strength objective is 205,000 soldiers, 12,900 civilians, roughly a 13% full-time manning. And we operate and have a footprint in all 54 states and territories and currently in over 30 countries. As of today, we have over 40,000 troops in direct support of Army Service Component Commands and combatant commands around the planet, and we are directly embedded in those COCOMs and those ASCCs. And that's important as we serve the nation at home and abroad. And that gets, and I'll circle back to that when I talk about P3I and Plan, Prepare, Provide. But our vision, life-saving, life-sustaining, is because the Army Reserve is predominantly combat service support and combat support. So when you think of all the great technical capability we need in our Army in service to the total Army and the nation, most of that technical capability does not reside in the regular Army and does not reside in our great Army National Guard. It resides in the Army Reserve. So for good or for bad, 94% of all the lawyers and legal units are in the Army Reserve. I think it's a good thing, but some people would argue with me on that. Most of your full spectrum engineering, Army Reserve. We were founded initially to get access to the private sector doctors and nurses. So most of your doctors and nurses are in the Army Reserve. I think it's almost approaching 80% of all the sustainers, logisticians, transporters for the total Army are in the Army Reserve. I think it's now approaching 80% for civil affairs, Army Reserve. So pick your favorite technical capability that we need in our total Army and total force. It's predominantly in the Army Reserve. So what do those technical enablers do? I would argue they save lives and they sustain lives. And so I think that's a good vision statement for the Army Reserve. Our mission is pretty simple. We provide soldiers, leaders, and units that have been trained, equipped, and are ready to meet Americans' requirements at home and abroad. Now, why do I say soldiers, leaders, and units? Because if you're not in the Army, a criticism of the Army is, you guys only want to send brigade combat teams. You only want to send units. Sometimes I don't need a unit. I need a few soldiers. Well, we do that. We tailor the package to meet the mission requirement, whether it's within our continental United States or overseas, and we do that by sometimes sending individual soldiers or small packs of soldiers and select leadership teams as well as units. And that's really a message to make sure that those outside the Army understand that we can tailor-make whatever they need to get the mission done. When we look at the priorities, you've got the strategic priorities, which are component, and you've got the command priorities, which are U.S. Army Reserve Command. Those are operational. This is important. So I talked about OCAR. Now, most people don't know what OCAR is. Office of the Chief of the Army Reserve. It's a very, very small staff located predominantly at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, with an OCAR Ford in the Pentagon. They're a miniature version of the Army staff, and their job is to help me execute my statutory responsibilities as Chief of the Army Reserve. There's only 2 generals in the Army that have a statutory responsibility to Congress for a component: the Chief of Staff of the Army and the Chief of the Army Reserve. And I take those responsibilities very seriously, and the Office of the Chief of the Army Reserve helps me execute those responsibilities and does the heavy lifting and engagements with the Army staff and the Pentagon to try to make sure as a component we stay resourced and we're able to understand the guidance and direction coming out of the Pentagon and also over on the Hill, because if we mess that up, we won't have the resourcing to equip the command called U.S. Army Reserve Command. And so let me quickly tick off the priorities at the component level. We got to develop, plan, program, and resource the Army Reserve 2025. I won't take you down that lane specifically, but that is a lot of hard, heavy lifting. If I started speaking in Pentagon speak, most of you would not understand the language I was speaking. Trust me, it is a complicated language. It is not a user-friendly language, but it is an essential language for us to compete for resources in the building called the Pentagon and over on the Hill. And that's really the bread and butter of what OCAR does every day. We have to develop national leaders. The Army Reserve doesn't just provide leaders to the Army Reserve and to the Army. We provide national leaders in the private sector, in the interagency. We're good at that. Everybody wants the Army Reserve. They want our Army Reserve soldiers, our great civilians, and of course, they are very much enamored by the support we get from our employers and our family members. Third one down, sustain the Army Reserve as an all-volunteer force. Every now and then you'll hear messages come up, well, we got to go back to the draft. I don't see that happening, okay? So it's critical that we maintain our all-volunteer force, and that's getting more and more hard, getting more and more difficult as we recognize that the majority of our young men and women that we desperately want to step up and serve the nation in uniform, that most of them are not qualified. I think it's 3 out of 4 Americans between 18 and 28 do not meet the minimum standards for joining the armed forces. There's lots of reasons for that. It might be physical fitness, it might be a record of some kind. Recently in the news, it could be they have a tattoo in the wrong place. Just seeing if you're paying attention, okay? So that's a real challenge for us, but we have to recognize we've got to sustain our all-volunteer force. And policies and procedures that OCAR helps me implement are critical to ensuring that we can do that. Ensuring the Army Reserve soldiers and civilians are committed to the Army and the profession of arms. We are a profession. It is by nature what keeps us in the Army and the military is our desire to serve others in uniform or support those in uniform as we serve America. Our profession is not like any other profession out there. Every poll that comes out, who gets rated #1 as the most admired? Well, the military, right? The military. So our nation and our citizens recognize that the profession that they admire the most as being professional and committed to serving the nation and others is those in our armed forces. We've got to remember that's not by accident. Excellence is by choice. It's not by chance. And we've got to remember how special the privilege is to wear the uniform and serve those who wear the uniform in service to our great nation. We have to recognize that we have to tell our story. Now, I'll criticize the Army Reserve a little bit. We're so focused on getting our job done and serving the big Army and the total force that we often don't do a good job about telling our story. Our culture in the Army Reserve is to be what? First and foremost, we're a soldier in the United States Army. We might eventually tell people we're in the Army Reserve, but our culture isn't, we don't think that way. We're a soldier because we work for the Army, we're in the Army. But often we don't give any credit to the component called the Army Reserve, and so people don't know who we are. It's not just a problem in the Army Reserve. The Navy Reserve doesn't do a good job of this, the Air Force Reserve, the Federal Reserve in general doesn't do a good job of this. If you're in the National Guard, I'll throw a plug out for the Guard. The Guard does a wonderful job of making people understand who they are and what they do, whether they're serving the nation at home or abroad. For reasons I can't explain, our culture is we don't do that. Part of it is because we just focus on getting our job done, and we don't have maybe some of the resourcing the National Guard has in strategically communicating who we are and what we do. You need to tell the story of the Army Reserve, and if you're not in the Army Reserve, you need to ask about the Army Reserve, and I think you'll be impressed, because everywhere the Guard is, the Army Reserve is right there with them, because they're our brothers and sisters, and we serve and support them as well as the rest of the Army and the rest of the force. Maximizing, well, the second to last one is plan, prepare, provide, and private-public partnership. Use those Army Reserve readiness and business models to help generate readiness as individuals, soldiers, and leaders and units, and recognize the significant benefit we have of having an Army Reserve Ambassadors program. We are unique in that we have Army Reserve Ambassadors, and that's unique to the Army Reserve. They're like CASAs, Civilian Aides to the Secretary of the Army. They're a powerful asset and benefit to use, but we don't use them to the extent that we should, and we don't include them into all the activities we do. And that's sad. Sad for us and sad for them. So need to know who they are and what they do. I'm going to talk about Plan, Prepare, Provide, and P3I in just a minute. I'll come back to that. And then we got to maximize the Army Reserve's global command. Again, only component of the Army that's a global command. This is very, very important. A recent illustration is we had a disaster event in the Philippines. We get a call from U.S. Army Pacific that says, hey, we need some vessels in the water, logistic vessels in the water to support 25th ID, and I need a 2-star on the ground, 24 hours to run and be the lead for U.S. Army Pacific in the Philippines. Army Reserve, same day response. We can do that because we are a command. So another way to look at it is when I'm talking to members of Congress and they'll say, and the Congress all know who our National Guard is, but they don't necessarily know who the Federal Reserve is. And so they'll say, so let me get this right. If I need help in West Virginia The Army Reserve can help me? Yes, it's called immediate authority. Company, down to the company level, they have the authority to help up to 72 hours to save life or limb and commit Army Reserve personnel and equipment. And so this senator, who used to be a governor, says, so who's the tag for the Army Reserve in West Virginia? I said, I am. So the tag for the Army Reserve for Virginia will also send forces? Who's that tag? I said, I am. I'm the tag for the United States. I'm the tag for Europe, for the world, for the Army Reserve. One command. If I don't have the command authority to commit forces immediately at home or abroad, I may have the statutory authority. A lot easier for us to get things done, believe it or not, than our sisters and brothers in other services and components. And we need to utilize that unique command authority that we have, and we need to tell people about it. Let me go on to the operational priorities real quick, because I don't want to run out of time. First one down there is to lead and grow other leaders. The most important thing we do as leaders is we grow other leaders. We ask ourselves, in whatever organization we lead, private or public sector, do we have the right type of leaders in our organization? Do we have that person in the right job? You might have them, to quote the old saying, good to great, or they're on the right bus, but they may not be in the right seat. So that's what we do as leaders. We're trying to groom other leaders, grow other leaders. We want the organization to run efficiently without us. When I was in academia, we used to call that practicing the presence of absence. I'll let you reflect on that. That's deep, okay? You can reflect on that, and we can talk about it at the break. But we've got to grow other leaders. That's the most important thing you do at any level in the Army Reserve. The second is we've got to man and care for our force, and this is pretty hard to do, especially in our current environment. But part of that is recognizing the terrible challenges we have with sexual assault, sexual harassment, suicide issues that are becoming more and more. Our numbers have gotten a little better in recent months, but historically it's been a problem for us in the Army Reserve over the last couple of years. Maintaining our force, when we talk about man and caring for our force, we think about in strength and we think about having stuff for our force. What I'm talking about here is not just the traditional stuff, it's making sure that as a family, and we're all part of the Army family, that we are taking care of each other and listening, trying to help each other, both in uniform and out of uniform, on duty and off duty, because that's what families do. Now, like a true family, you don't always have to like your family members, huh? But you gotta love them, right? Okay? Sometimes it's tough love, but we are a family. So I emphasize Fort Family, and in the letter that I wrote inside the cover, I mentioned Fort Family and give a phone number. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you can call Fort Family and get a real person, and they will help you with whatever your problem or challenge is. You might want to report sharp a sexual assault, a sexual harassment. You might be feeling suicidal or know someone that's suicidal. You might want to find out a new unit. You might want to find out how can I get a job for my family member or for my spouse. One-stop shop, Fort Family, 24/7. I'm expanding that program, and that's under the leadership of Jim Balaki and others that are part of Jim's team, okay? And that is a real positive return on our investment in the Army Reserve, and that's why I'm going to expand our support in Fort Family. The next command priority is train to standard. This is what's happened over the years is we've gotten away from knowing how to train our formations. For 13 years, we've had others train our formations for us as we go out the door, predominantly contractors. Some of you are a little older, not maybe as old as me, but a little older, and you remember when we had to train our own formations. We have to go back and learn how to train our own soldiers and our own formations. We can't rely on contractors to do it. Not that I'm ragging on or picking on contractors. We critically need their support, but we need them to do things that we can't do, not things that we can and should do. And so remember the old-fashioned training meetings and discussing how we train our formations? That's the best type of leader development you can get. It's how do we figure out how to train our formations to execute our unit mission and then have that friction and dialogue and positive discussion to try to get those great training events at the individual, leader, staff, and collective level. And in that process, I guarantee you, you'll generate great leaders. We've gotten away from that. I think it's almost 70% of the Army Reserve joined since 9/11. So they only know an Army that's got nothing but milk and honey. right? Lots of money, lots of resources. They don't know the old days when we had to do a lot more and didn't always have the resourcing. I'm not saying do more with less. That's stupid. You do less with less. But we've got to get back to making sure that we train our formations, and that's how we generate our leaders. We've got to use resources responsibly. We're pretty darn efficient in the Army Reserve. I think 5.8, 5.9% of the Army's budget for almost 20% of the force. In fact, we get frequently cited by the Army as incredibly efficient in all we do. I would argue sometimes we're efficient, we're not effective, so think about that. Sometimes you can be so efficient, you're not effective. We have to always be effective, but we also want to be efficient and be good stewards of our taxpayers' money. We're doing very good in this area, but there's always rooms for more. We always have to remember, it's not our money. And we have to find ways to spend less and to find where do you get a better return on our investment for wherever we are spending our money. And that's everybody's job in the Army Reserve. We've got to generate readiness in all that we do. So think about all the stuff that you do if you're in the Army or supporting the Army. If it doesn't generate readiness, if it doesn't make more readied soldiers, civilians, families, leaders, and units, you shouldn't do it. Push back. And not everything is as important as something else. So if it's not generating readiness, and you can't see how it's generating readiness, as measured on the unit status report, so I'm going to get a little specific here, but further down there I talk about the USR. The unit status report is the only thing you do in USARC land that measures your readiness. And so if it's not building readiness as measured on your as unit status report, done by command teams, not by unit administrators, okay, then you have to ask yourself, might be a nice thing to do, but maybe we shouldn't be doing it. And then the bottom one is really critical. You got to live the Army values. You got to enforce accountability and discipline. All right? So there's this concept out there that maybe we don't always hold people accountable, and we don't want to because we don't want to push them out of the service because our in-strength numbers are down and we're trying to preserve in-strength. Wrong. If they do not meet the standard, and you have been a compassionate leader and done everything you can to help them meet the Army standard, and they failed to meet the Army standard, you are obligated to kick them out of the United States Army. Okay? We have an obligation to America to meet the mission requirements. You won't find a more compassionate person to me than when I see a soldier who's trying to lose the weight and pass the PT test. I'm particularly gotten more sensitive since I've gotten older and gotten sick a couple times, okay? But we've got to hold people accountable. Everybody's been in a unit that knows when the command teams hold soldiers accountable, what happens? Anybody that's good wants to get in that unit, right? And we want all of our units to be that way, and we want to hold leaders accountable at all levels, from general officers down to the lowest ranking non-commissioned officer. So read the vision, mission, and priorities, and hopefully it'll become very clear. Now, as I wrap up my discussion, I want to go to the next slide. Well, eventually it'll get there. Open to the center panel. Go ahead and advance the next slide, who's ever worked in the computer. Okay, I'll get to at a glance in just a second. So in the center, you see plan, prepare, provide, and private-public partnership. Okay, plan, prepare, provide. There's two ways that we generate readiness. Everything we do, as General Milley, the FORSCOM CG, said multiple times yesterday at different forums, is we're either in preparation for war or we're at war. That's it. And so if we're not implementing and exercising readiness in a combat environment or executing a contingent mission, we are what? Preparing that readiness. So we have a government approach and a non-government approach for generating readiness in the Army Reserve. Our readiness model is called Plan, Prepare, Provide. So you're probably familiar with ARFORGEN, Army Force Generation Model. Probably going to change the name of that and change how that model looks here in the near future. FORSCOM's been tasked to do that from the chief, and they're working on it. What we do is our readiness model is Plan, Prepare, Provide, and it will not change regardless of what the new ARFORGEN model looks like, smells like, or is called. The idea here is to keep the Army Reserve de facto part of the operational force. Some would say you use us in that available year. Whenever the Army says that unit's in the available year, you have to use them, right? If you don't use them, they'll lose that capability of that readiness. My opinion is that's not enough. You've got to utilize the Army Reserve throughout the readiness cycle, regardless of what we call that, and you do that through Plan, Prepare, Provide. So the plan piece starts with RAF, Regional Alignment of Forces. The Chief has talked a lot about aligning Army forces regionally to support Army Service Component Commands and Combatant Commands. And so the Army Reserve has done that as well as part of supporting the Chief's plan. Part of our RAF, which is aligning all of our Army Reserve units to every Army Service Component Command, right? So U.S. Army Pacific, U.S. Army Europe, U.S. Army Africa, pick your favorite ASCC, all right? We have created Army Reserve engagement cells and teams. These are full-time manning and traditional reservists, and they are embedded directly in every ASCC or COCOM, to include USASOC, General Cleveland's command, and SOCOM, because they need a lot of technical enablers too in the special ops world, right? That is our centerpiece, the ARECs and the ARETs, okay? The prepare piece is total Army training as part of Bold Shift in 1st Army and General Mike Tucker's initiative there, where we train as a total Army and as a total force. If we don't keep doing that, we will lose that capability to communicate and work with each other, and the time to figure that out is not when you're going downrange. And the third piece is to provide those resources, or provide those units, soldiers, leaders, and units, when the requirement comes up. Whether it's Ebola in Liberia, which the Army Reserve is preparing to support, or whether it's capabilities in Iraq, and the Army Reserve has soldiers in Iraq, and we still have about 5,000 in Afghanistan and also 30 other countries. So that's the Plan, Prepare, Provide piece. That's the government approach. But if you didn't get the memo, we're broke. The United States is broke, and it's not going to get any better with sequestration and the Budget Control Act. In fact, the Chief said it this morning, the Army is going to go off a cliff in FY16 unless the Budget Control Act is amended. And that will affect the readiness of our total Army to include us. So we have to find a way to generate readiness outside of using government resources, and that is our P3I initiative, Private-Public Partnership. Look at it in your brochure. I want to show you a very short video just to whet your appetite, and then I want to quickly mention at a glance and then get into Q&A. So go ahead and roll the video, please.
The Army Reserve has provided cutting-edge civilian and industry-based expertise to the force for more than a century. But today's complex and growing security challenges can't be solved by governments alone. It's going to take governments and the private sector. The Army Reserve's Private-Public Partnership, or as we like to refer to it, P3I, allows industry leaders to leverage the civilian capabilities and military leadership of our citizen soldiers. Startup companies to Fortune 100 companies partner with the Army Reserve and hire our citizen soldiers because they make great employees. The thought is, how do we work together, government and the private sector, to create a program that really allows us to help those companies and at the same time help improve the readiness of our soldiers, leaders, and units in the Army Reserve.
Kenai Drilling is one of the largest privately owned drilling contractors in the United States. You know, everyone goes, why do you hire Army Reserve soldiers? And really you want to say, well, because everybody loves soldiers. We hire soldiers because we owe them and there's a great service. And that's true, completely true. However, it's kind of selfish too. Any employer wants good people, and the Army Reserve provides that. They bring both soft skills, they bring hard skills, they have the ability to identify hazards, they have leadership qualities that are just exceptional in comparison to civilian counterparts.
Well, this is a unique environment in that there are extremely short turnaround periods. You need to be decisive about the decisions that you make. You need to be confident that the decisions you make are good ones. The soldiers that we've had here are able to do all of those things and more. They have a confidence that really helps them thrive here.
What the military has taught me was discipline, being prepared, you know, really looking at a problem and trying to find out how to solve that problem. And all of those skills come into play when you work for any company.
In my line of work, everything must be very exact. A commercial has to air when it's supposed to air. And we have to be on time, we have to be off on time. Army Reserve soldiers, like any military that come in, have that discipline. The people I've met throughout the military, and the Army especially, are so well educated and so prepared and so on top of their game. It's really impressive to see the people that are leading our military today.
I learned core leadership skills being an officer, and you want that type of employee to be in your business to help it grow and flourish and to work more efficiently.
For anyone that's looking for mission accomplishment with resilience, with values, with discipline, and with a ton of technical skills, I don't see why they wouldn't go to the Army and tap their reserve, help develop them, and reintegrate that back on the society after their missions. So when you talk about win-win, here it is.
Private sector helps us to be better soldiers, while we help them to succeed by sharing the skills and experiences we've learned for more than a century. Here's an excellent opportunity to help your Army Reserve develop solutions to some of our nation's greatest challenges.
With private sector, for-profit and not-for-profit. It's been exceptionally well received. Because of time, I won't go into any more details about some of the specific projects. Maybe that'll come out in QA. The last thing I want to say before we get into Q&A is about 4 or 5 months ago, I'm not quite sure when it was, Franklin or Melissa, but I was looking at this book called Congress at Your Fingertips. Maybe some of you have seen it. And I was thinking about the conversation I had with members where they're trying to say, well, who's the tag? And then real tags, the adjutant generals for states, asking me how do we access the Army Reserve, governors. And so the idea was to produce a book that would be predominantly directed towards members of Congress and their staff to let them know what the Army Reserve is by state. And we have a new economic model courtesy of a professor at George Mason that shows this tremendous economic impact to each state from the Army Reserve. It also summarizes in here our role to DISCA, immediate authority, private-public partnership, and all 54 states and territories are in here. This just came off the press, and we're just starting to distribute it out. Tremendous reviews. The chief, when he saw it, and the secretary were blown away, as were some of the other members that have already seen it. So take a look at a glance. Get a copy of it or look for it online. It's a remarkable document. We'll recognize the person really that was responsible for putting it all together at the end of Q&A, which is Melissa Russell over here to my left, your right. So with that, I'm going to cut it off and go ahead and go into questions and answers or discussions. We can talk about anything you want to talk about. I think they probably want you to go up to a microphone so we can hear the question or the comment. Remember, all of the other senior leaders that are up here who are needy and want your question so they can answer. So with that, let's go ahead and get into the open forum. Who wants to be first? For the senior leaders, if you want to answer the question, just come up here to the microphone here. Who's going to be first? There'll be somebody. There we go. Yes, Adam.
Sir, Colonel Adam Roth, Office Chief Engineers, Headquarters DA. Thanks for what you and Linda do for our Army Reserve, our Army, and our nation. Thank you. Total Force Policy yesterday was a great discussion, but I could see some things that were common patterns. You touched on it, but I want to talk a little bit about it today. We talked about, and it was General Milley talked about this treadmill of training that we've had for the last 10 years, where we forgot, you talked about the medal assessments, the training management, and how to do it. If we're ever to be an agile force and win in a complex world, if we can't do a quick medal assessment, what's the job, what do I need, and how do I go? We lost the bubble. Second piece General Tucker talked about was maintenance. We lost that. Germany in the 80s, Mondays we were always in the motor pool. We did this. 2404s, you had TMs, they were all dirty, and you wanted them to be dirty. That means soldiers were using them. I think we lost the bubble. And the last thing was talent management. We have an Army Reserve Personnel Advisor Program, or ARPAs, or as much talent management. Don't see a whole lot in your Rally Point 32.1, perhaps needs inclusion, but it's the talent management, because everything we do is training, and we manage our soldiers through talent management. Thanks for your time, sir.
Okay, those are great comments, Adam. Thank you. Adam and I have known each other for a long time. The first one just kind of reinforces what I already said, and that's about training. This is not an Army Reserve problem, it's an Army problem. units don't know how to do their own training anymore. I'll use our son, Matthew, as an example. So we have a son who's a no time in grade captain, I think May 1st or something. Engineer officer, just branch transferred to SF land, had, I think, 2 of his first 3 years in Afghanistan. So Matt comes back from his first rotation in Afghanistan. I think he's getting ready to head over to NTC and Ranger School before he goes back. And he calls me up and says, "Hey, Dad, I got to run a range. This is hard. How do you run a range?" And the reason we're kind of laughing is, yeah, I remember running ranges. They're hard. To do a range right with all of the necessary PMI, pre-marksmanship instructions, and all the other things, it's really, really hard. But our soldiers and our NCOs and officers don't know how to do it anymore because they haven't had to. How do you run a range? You just pull up and you park your stuff and you do whatever the civilian in the tower tells you to do. So that's the first point. We've got to get back to saying, what is our unit's mission? And does the mission statement need to change based upon regional alignment of forces? Because now that I've aligned all the forces in the Army Reserve, I expect you to be a cultural linguist, interested or expert in that region that you're aligned to, and that's part of your mission statement now, as opposed to just mobilize and deploy and execute certain missions. And so you got to look at your mission statement, get it right based upon RAF, look at your new medal, mission essential task list, and then recognizing that you're only going to be able to do so much training, collective, individual and staff and collective, and you're never going to get it all done. So you've got to pick the payoff collective task and leader tasks that you think are most important. I would argue when we think of leadership development, how are we going to get through all these challenges? You lead through these challenges. How do you generate those leaders? Through training meetings, through training discussions, planning and executing training, recognizing it will not go right most of the time. You always learn more when things go wrong than when they go right. So it kind of builds on the point that Adam made on the first piece. The third piece was talent management. Adam, what was the second piece? Maintenance. So it kind of goes with that too. What happened is, you know, we own almost all the sustainers in the Army Reserve, but we can't fix our own stuff anymore because how do you fix it? Well, that's something the contractors do down there in the motor pool, and that's the AUSA shop. Wrong. We've got to go back and recognize that's another way you generate leaders is by getting in the motor pool and learning how to take care of your equipment and maintaining it. And I remember command motor stables was a religion in the Army when I was growing up. And there was a lot of good leadership lessons were learned in the motor pool when you had a command formation and you focused on accountability and maintaining. We've gotten away from that. We've got to reinstitute those things. Talent management, critical. You're right, I didn't specifically call that out in Rally Point 32.1. Here's the good news. As the total Army draws down, the Army can afford to be even more selective of the very high standards we have for our soldiers. And as the active Army draws down and loses a lot of incredibly highly qualified talent because they just can't keep the size of the force they want, we will benefit from that in the Army Reserve as we get those men and women, particularly with combat experience, coming into the Army Reserve. And so we're doing lots of things in talent management, but you're right, maybe I'll look at, before the final 32.1 comes out, putting a piece in there. So those are great comments from Adam Roth. Other comments or questions or discussions? Who wants to go next? And if you want to direct, I'm going to keep pushing the other leaders up here. Just tell me who you want to answer the question, and I'm sure they'll be eager to jump up.
Sir, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Gary Casey. I work in HQDA G357, and I'm one of your AGR soldiers who's appointed there. I just wanted to ask you a question. How do you overcome the obstacles, the cultural change within the Pentagon as we see as different things such as the ARET when you're putting forward an initiative where you're not getting the right response from our other components?
Let me rephrase the question. I think the question was, how do you get things done in the Pentagon? Who? Okay, it's a great question. The first thing is you gotta manage your expectations and you gotta manage your stress. So you gotta keep your PT up. You gotta find a way to get your PT in every day, even though you won't get it in every day. You can't be a micromanager. You've got to trust others, and you got to recognize the way you get things done in the Pentagon, regardless of whether you're a Secretary of Defense or just a lowly 3-star general, is the same way you got things done when you were in a platoon and you were going to the supply sergeant. If you're a lieutenant, you go to the supply sergeant, you say, "Hey, Sergeant, I'm in 1st Platoon," or now, of course, we don't use those numbers anymore. or whatever your platoon nomenclature is, and I need X amount of equipment for my platoon because they're getting ready to do an FTX, and I start barking at that supply sergeant, and I'm a lieutenant, and they're an E6, am I going to get my stuff? Probably not. What's a seasoned supply sergeant going to do to that lieutenant? Yeah, he'll find ways to get you out of the office and not meet your requirements. What do I mean by that analogy? It's all about relationships. You learn from that young experience, you build relationships, you demonstrate you are a caring, compassionate professional, and others of like mindsets will want to help you, regardless of their rank or position. So what I have to do in the Pentagon is I have to spend a lot of time educating and informing on the Army Reserve. It never stops. It's like anybody stationed in Korea, as soon as you get things fixed, they break again, right? Because everybody leaves. Cool? All right? So you have to constantly educate and inform on what the Army Reserve is and what our needs are. You have to recognize most of the time it's not a conspiracy against the reserve component, because conspiracies take energy, deliberate planning. They're too hard to do. We can't do them when we want to do them. So you just have to keep building those relationships. And that's why the OCAR and the other senior leadership is so important. You can't do it by yourself. So you have to build those relationships. I focus on something I learned as a CEO. I do only what I can do. Most of the stuff that needs to get done, there's other people that can do it, many times much better than I can. So I should only do what I can do, because one, I have that capability, or sometimes it does require someone in authority or rank. Or to be frank, every now and then I need to do some stuff I like to do, right? Otherwise I'll get bored and become a non-participant. Cool? All right? But you have to find a way to build those relationships. So I work really hard to strengthen my relationship with the Secretary, the Chief, the Army staff, the SecDef staff, members on the Hill. I'd like to believe I have a really strong reputation and relationship with all of them. And they try to help me in the Army Reserve every time I come and ask them for help. The problem is almost never them. The problem is the folks that work for them, because when it starts working the process, you know, it's kind of like, you know, when you're, it's always easier to say no than yes, right? And so you just have to be very deliberate and very diligent and keep hammering the process, recognizing that whether it was combining the Army Reserve Pre-Command course at the battalion brigade level with the AC, it only took me 2 years, 6 months to do it, and I started working it hard from day one. The ARECs have been incredibly difficult, even though it's free chicken that we're paying for and everybody recognizes as a great and wonderful thing. But here's a news flash. Sometimes great and wonderful things are hard to push through a system, even if everybody agrees they're great and wonderful. So the key is don't get discouraged, build those positive relationships, and keep pushing. I'm sure it's the same at your level, right? Because higher headquarters is always screwed up, right? And isn't that an Army tradition, right? But it's not necessarily always screwed up. We just have to work harder to push things through. Great comment. Other comments or questions on anything?
Sir.
Got one over here?
Go ahead.
Please. Don't let Franklin push you around. Go ahead, get up there.
Sir, Colonel Steve Knott, Commander of U.S. Army Garrison, Fort McCoy. With FY16 looming and the corresponding tough decisions that have to be made on what to reduce, what to eliminate, what does the Army Reserve foresee as the impacts on collective training, especially in regards to major exercises? To what degree do we think that collective training will have to be a bill payer?
Yeah, it's a great question. Did everybody understand or hear the question? It's basically, what's the impact of sequestration in 16 and beyond for the Army Reserve? Well, I alluded to what the Chief said this morning, that if the Budget Control Act stays the law of the land in FY16, which is not that far away, the Army will go off a cliff in terms of readiness, to include the Army Reserve. That is true. What I've testified to and continue to testify to the Congress and to anybody that will listen, to be frank, is the Army Reserve is a de facto become part of the operating force. We will become a strategic reserve again, not because of in-strength numbers, but because of money. General Milley alluded to this yesterday in the total force panel discussion. When we start getting hung up on in-strength numbers, when you really don't know what capabilities you need, you got to start out with, so the first thing, let's do a thought experiment, as we used to say in academia. So if you're trying to design, so if all of you were just given the task, design Army 2025, what should it look like? Light, medium, heavy forces, active guard, reserve, what should it look like? The first thing you have to say is, what will the enemies of the United States look like in 2025? And our allies? Who will be our allies? How do you respond? Is prevent, shape, and win strategy the right strategy? That's impossible to do, right? But you have to start there, and then you say, what capabilities do we need? All that gets transmitted into the national security strategy, national military strategy, right? And then that determines, the problem we've got is we've got a resource-constrained strategy because of sequestration. So right now, as the chief has said, all three components of our Army in order to pay the bills that we have to pay for the Budget Control Act, there's nowhere else to pay them except out of readiness. All right? So we will lower our readiness. So in the case of the Army Reserve, and again, I don't want to be negative, because we will lead ourselves out of this problem. We have to. We have to lead ourselves out of the problem rather than wring our hands and say, woe is me. But we get funded statutorily 39 training days a year, right? 48 battle assemblies divided by 2, tracking, 2 weeks of AT, it's 39 days. If you do all the stuff we have in 350-1, which is the Army regulation that says every soldier of every component's got to be able to do all this stuff to be ready, it's 32 days if you add in administrative requirements. So guess what? Before you've gotten any additional training done, you've already spent through all of your annual training and your battle assemblies for the most part. So we rely on what we call RPA plus up and some OMAR money, historically out of OCO. So I got to be careful. I don't want to get too much into the Pentagon speak. We rely on that to generate that higher level of readiness. We're not going to have that higher level of readiness. So we will become strategic, in my opinion, and possibly become, as General O said at breakfast this morning, a Task Force Smith in the Army, or could become a Task Force Smith in the future if we're not able to undo sequestration. What will I do in the Army Reserve? I will have to recognize that I can't resource units the same. Not all units are created equal, and I have to focus on those that are closer to the available year and make sure that I am giving them resources that I'm taking away from other units in the Army Reserve to make sure that we do what? That we never send a soldier, leader, or unit out the door to execute a mission where they are not trained, equipped, and ready. Because that's absolutely violates who we are as a nation and who we are as the armed forces. But right now, it's looking very, very bleak. And so we are going to have to become very creative. And at the end of the day, I'm trying to get relief from 350-1 and tell you, does it make sense that a soldier or a unit that's in train ready 1, 2, or reset, why should they have to do all that stuff that's in AR 350-1? Seems silly to me. So what we have to do is start saying, what are the few things we need to do that we get the best return on investment for the limited time and money we have? And those are the things we need to do. And I would argue it's training. It's generating leaders, growing leaders, by planning and executing training, whatever that training is, individual, leader, or collective. Did I answer your question? Yes, sir. Okay. I think there was a comment over here, Franklin.
We've talked at length about what we want to do with the Army Reserve at a glance and telling the Army Reserve story. As a paid political announcement, I want to get you to tell the folks here about the Army Reserve at a glance as a tool and what they should do with it.
Well, the first thing I'd ask is read it. You kind of laugh about that, but I'll comment on General Perkins. TRADOC worked really hard to crank out all of our new updated doctrine, and it's actually really good, but you got to read it. And for those colonels and lieutenant colonels in the room, we used to talk about going to the Army War College and say, yeah, it's a lot of work, but only if you do it. Okay? So the first thing I would ask is to read it, to read Rally Point 32, to read Rally Point 32.1. Half of it is pictures, okay? It's only like 3 to 4 pages long. Read that, because my opinion is if you know the commander's intent and you are a leader yourself and you have some resourcing and you have people leaving you alone, you don't need anything else, right? You'll get the job done. And so start by reading at a glance. You don't have to read every page of it because it's pretty thick. But flip through there and see what's in it, and then use it by what? Partnering with your Army Reserve ambassadors, talking to your local, state, and federal representation in the government, to include members of Congress. Use your network. Everybody here has got a network. Use your network to educate and inform, not lobby. We don't lobby in the Army Reserve, but we educate and inform people about the Army Reserve. use it to educate people in the private sector about why Army Reserve soldiers and family members make great employees. You'll find that this one-stop book is really, really valuable. It's tremendously well done. How was that, Franklin? Okay? I thought I saw the surgeon over here. Okay, yes.
Morning, sir. Colonel Neil Maher, you're a surgeon. You know that, but for the rest of the audience. Sir, you taught us today about Rally Point 32.1, and it is a great document. The first speaker this morning, besides yourself, talked about equipment and how important it is to keep equipment ready. Unlike other two services that deploy platforms, the Army is soldiers, and so soldier readiness is of critical importance. And a big part of soldier readiness, of course, I'm a surgeon, is medical readiness. And sir, I would urge inserting just a few words in here that not only talks about soldier readiness and unit readiness, but individual medical readiness. Resources are available outside of training requirements to get it done, and commanders can get their soldiers medically ready. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thanks, Neil. This actually came up yesterday also on the Total Force Policy panel, and one of the comments that I think Paul Patrick made, I think Paul either made it or mentioned it to me. I don't know if Paul's still in here, but he mentioned TRICARE Reserve Select. I'm pretty sure he made the comment. That's the best thing going, let me tell you. So when I got drafted back in the regular Army to be the chief, they made me give up TRICARE Reserve Select. Linda and I kicked and screamed and said, no, I don't want to go on TRICARE. And I'm not knocking TRICARE, but TRICARE Reserve is awesome. The fees, monthly fees, are relatively low, and you go direct to any specialist you want, and it's just fantastic. Now, they said, sorry, you're in the Army now, so you don't get your TRICARE Reserve Select. I said, I'll pay for it. No, the Army wouldn't let me pay for it. We're at Walter Reed, so I guess you shouldn't feel too sorry for us. But my point is that's a benefit that we have, that if you enroll in TRICARE Reserve Select and our supplemental dental insurance, you can make sure that, because what the surgeon's talking about is individual medical readiness. And we have the highest level of individual medical readiness we've ever had in the Army Reserve, and it is absolutely going to take a nosedive because I can't resource it at the same level we have in the past because of sequestration. And so that would be an example. So those are really good points. But I will tell you what worries me, and I said this yesterday, is I don't want to have a unit that's going out the door in the available year and find out that I got to do a lot of cross-leveling because the individual soldiers aren't medically ready. Now, if they go to a MOB site for a named operation, it's not an issue. We can normally get them medically ready in short order at a MOB site. But what if it's a contingent mission, like Ebola? There is no MOB site. They call up the Army Reserve and say, I need units now, and you launch today. You don't go to a MOB site for a contingent mission. So medical readiness is a huge thing that I've been mentioning to the Congress, and that the Army and the Army National Guard has also emphasized this point. We're going to take a huge nosedive in individual medical readiness because of the cut to our readiness budget. And I'm not sure a whole lot I can do other than maybe emphasize TRICARE Reserve Select and other avenues. I'm open for any suggestions, and I made a notion like this. Marty, somebody's copying down that comment, right? I got time for two or three more? Okay. Yes.
Sir, good morning.
Alberto Resende.
Yes, sir. Al Resende, Atlantic Division 75th Training Command. Good morning. Yesterday during the session, during General Milley's session, they were talking with General Tucker, and he talked about how Bold Shift and the Exhort is going to come out today. It was going to be published. And so I haven't seen it, and I don't know what the intent is on their shift going into pre-MOB training support. Could you talk a little bit about that, what the discussion has been about that?
I can.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thanks, Al. Historically, because the requirements were to get units out the door to support named operations, right? Iraq and Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. First Army had to focus on executing training to the right of the MOB site. In fact, as you probably all know, once you go to the MOB site, you no longer belong to the United States Army Reserve Command. You are assigned to First Army, and you are a First Army asset as one of their subordinate units until you actually get to theater and are reassigned to the unit of operation. They want to help to the left of the MOB site. Now, whose responsibility is it in the Army Reserve to make sure that soldiers, leaders, and units are ready to the left of the MOB site by statute. It's my responsibility as the chief and as a CG. And it's your responsibility for those that are in the Army Reserve that are members of the command team or senior leadership. But First Army recognizes that with the number of requirements post-MOB going down, right? Now that could change tomorrow, right? But we're out of Iraq, but now we're going back into Iraq a little bit, right? We have a division headquarters there and some other assets. And we're going to wait and see what happens now with the agreement in place in Afghanistan. But let's just say the president continues to have us draw down in Afghanistan and not significantly commit forces, ground forces in Iraq, which is the current direction and guidance from the Commander-in-Chief, which we will absolutely execute. That means First Army is probably not going to see a lot of business to the right of the MOB date, right? So what are they going to do? And by the way, most of First Army historically is Army Reserve soldiers, okay? Predominantly Title X soldiers in the Army Reserve. Well, what they want to do is they want to move to the left of the MOB site to help Army Reserve and Army National Guard units train and get ready. And I welcome that. Now, that doesn't negate it's our responsibility and it's my responsibility up to the date of the MOB. But I'll take all the help I can get. Anybody want to throw free chicken my way to help me in the Army? I'm tired of giving the free chicken. I want to get some free chicken. So anybody who wants to throw it my way to help train our leaders, our soldiers, and our units, I'm all for it. And that's what Bold Shift's all about. To answer your question, Al?
Sorry, just a little bit more operational. Any discussion? I know that yesterday they were talking about the different exercises, both National Guard and our CSTP program, but did they talk about landing the ship a little bit, what they're going to try to do left of the...
Well, one of the reasons Bold Shift's getting reorganized is I'm taking back 3,000-4,000 troops from the Army Reserve, and I'm taking them out of First Army and redistributing them in the force. So I'm shrinking the number of Army Reserve forces in First Army to redistribute in terms of, because I have to bring down the force structure for the Army Reserve. So as I brought it down, I felt like I had too many forces committed to First Army, and I needed to downsize that a little bit. So part of this is restructuring and reorganizing, and as Mike Tucker mentioned yesterday in the forum, providing more CS and CSS trained leaderships and cadre, because historically they're all about BCTs, Brigade Combat Teams, all right? What's the direct impact on the Army Reserve? It won't change. You need to be looking for a validating exercise when you come up to your final train-ready 3-year. It might be called something different than that in the next 6 months. That validating exercise, first and foremost, probably should be a CTC or an exercise that's connected to a combat training center exercise, which WAR-X's and CSTX's are now being linked by the 84th, and the 75th is an important part of that. And so I don't think you're going to see a big change because the Army Reserve is kind of already ahead of the game in terms of this. Historically, we've done a great job training our formation to the left of the MOB site, and then when they get to the MOB site, they're out of there in 30 days. It's different when you have combat effects formation. So I don't think you'll see a big change right away in the Army Reserve. Is that okay? Are you wearing something on your uniform I didn't notice before? Okay. Okay. Well, I thought I saw something. Yes, sir.
Good morning, sir. Colonel Tim Connolly, Army Reserve Officer with the Army Secretariat. So you mentioned that the active component with the drawing down is going to have a greater reliance on the reserve component operationally moving forward. My question's about 12304 Bravo. What do you see as the largest obstacles towards the greater leveraging of 12304 Bravo and getting greater reserve component involvement in support of combatant commander missions worldwide?
Okay, great question. So the question was about 12304 Bravo, which was part of the National Defense Act of 2012. And we talked earlier about how do we use Federal Reserve forces and involuntarily mobilize them to support needs at home in complex catastrophes. That's 12304 Alpha under the National Defense Act. There's also 12304 Bravo that said, hey, if a combatant commander thinks they need to have reserve support, where a reserve unit could be involuntarily mobilized and deployed to support contingent operations within their AOR, area of responsibility, we think that would be a positive thing too. So that's all part of 12304 Alpha and 12304 Bravo. Alpha is the homeland, so that's NORTHCOM and General Jacoby. 12304 Bravo is the rest of the world, all right? Here's the trick. That's legislation. So if I tell you to do something but it's a UFR, does it get done? What's a UFR? Unfinanced requirement, right? So if I send you a nice little 3-star note and tell you to do something, but it's a UFR, can you do it? No, you kind of say, hey, why'd Talley send me a directive to do this when he didn't resource it? So it's intellectual dialogue, right? But that doesn't actually execute anything if you don't have resourcing. So 12304 Bravo is in the law, but it has to be palmed. So there has to be a demand signal from a combatant command sent to the Pentagon, in this case through the Army Service Component Command, asking for that Army Reserve Engineer Company medical unit, and then they put it in the Army budget, and then it gets forecast and it gets missioned. Okay? Now, the Army Reserve engagement cells at the Army Senior Service Component Commands and the Army Reserve engagement teams, which will be at every combatant command, and also have them at TSOCs, at USASOC. I know I'm using some acronyms. I apologize for that. Their job is to help the ASCC, to include USASOC, figure out how do you send that demand signal through the COCOM, through the Pentagon, to ask for those Army Reserve assets so they'll be budgeted. Here's the problem. There's some money that's been budgeted for 12304B. It's a very small amount of money, and every reserve component is trying to spend it 10 times over. Okay? Now, there has recently been some discussion, and again, open source, I can't confirm or deny, but there may have been some approval on using 12304B assets to perhaps support things in Africa. So why was the Army Reserve and the Reserve Forces not necessarily involved right up front in Ebola in Africa? What was the number one reason? It wasn't because, remember, we have the medical expertise, so why didn't they come right to the Army Reserve? Authority. Authority. What would be the authority? I have the authority to launch anybody in the Army Reserve up to 29 days AT anywhere in the world, and we do that all over the place. More than 29 days takes what? If you're a unit. Takes some sort of mobilization authority. So what would be the mobilization authority? Is Africa, do we have a named operation going on in Africa? Well, there's a debate on authority, and there's a debate on that question. So right now, they're trying to get approval authority for 12304B to support AFRICOM, to support the Ebola contingent crisis. So then you have an authority to mobilize involuntarily reserve component assets to support that requirement. But that's kind of where we are. 12304B is a wonderful thing. We just got to get the COCOMs to send the demand signal and have us budget it in the Army's budget process.